Those of you who have been parents or caregivers to infants, can you imagine with me that you have an infant in your arms and the baby has fallen asleep and you're ready to put them down for a nap? What position do you choose? If you were a parent before the 1990s, you would likely put the child on their tummy, because that's what the parenting experts of the early 20th century, including Dr. Spock, advised. The rationale was that if a child spit up, they would be able to clear it from their mouths and they would not choke. But if, however, you have cared for infants sometime since the 1990s, you likely would have put the baby down on their back. This was a dramatic change in the 1990s in advice to caregivers of infants, because new research had shown that babies sleeping on their backs were much less likely to die of sudden infant death syndrome. This change happened around the time that our oldest daughter was born. It was stressful for me to have this new way of thinking about it. I'd grown up seeing my younger siblings sleeping on their stomachs. When I babysat, I put all those babies in their cribs face down. As a new parent now, I worried about plenty of things about the safety of my child, but this was especially fraught. All my life, what I had seen and what I had been taught was that the safest way for a baby to be put in bed was to put them on their tummies. But now here's this new research and new advice and a new campaign to educate parents about the dangers of tummy sleeping. It challenged what I was sure to be true, and I resisted for a while. But I read more, and I talked with the pediatrician, and I eventually felt comfortable about this change, and I followed it. But it did take some time and some effort to come to a new conclusion. Change, transformation is not easy, y'all. You know that, right? However, as Unitarian Universalists, many of us are quite familiar with having a dramatic change in our perspective and our understanding of how the world works. For example, a large percentage of people who are now UUs did not grow up in this faith. Now, there are a lot of things to explore in that statement. Things to grieve, like the fact that our kids often drift away and don't stay as members. And there are things to celebrate, like the fact that we have something to offer that people are looking for. But we're not going to explore those today. Those are for the future. This sermon is about humility and an openness to being transformed. Since I've become a Unitarian Universalist, I've heard countless stories of people who have come to this faith as adults because of a change in their perspective. My own story is one of those, and it may be that yours is too. Sometimes this change in perspective happens because of a dramatic event. Maybe something happened at your previous religious home, or a drastic change in your life circumstances. And sometimes it's just a slow drifting away from a theology that no longer seems to fit, or a gradual realization, if you were not part of any religious community, that maybe you want more support and more community in your spiritual life. So here's something that I think is interesting about human development and about perspective shifting. And I'm going to ask you to join me in a thought experiment. So participate as you can. It will depend on how old you are, how far this works for you. So think back about yourself when you were in your late teens. You had opinions, I'm sure. You knew who you were. You had an understanding about the answers to some of these big questions like, who is God? Or why am I on this earth? Who am I supposed to be? You probably had some priorities based on your values and who you thought you were. So think about the things that you were sure of at that point in your life. And I'll be quiet for a second so you can think. What were you sure about? So go forward a decade or so into your 20s or 30s. What were you sure of when you were that age? And if you're over 40, what were you sure of when you were in your 40s? If you can imagine the decades of your life, try to recall your perspectives at each interval. And I'll be quiet again so you can think. Is there anybody in the room who still has the same beliefs that they did as a young adult? I mean, if you are a young adult, then it's hard to know, right? Yeah. Okay. I know I don't. Can you recall those changes and in your beliefs and the things that you were sure of? And can you recall the people or events that challenged your perspective that caused you to change? I hope that you have changed and grown, because as John Pavlovitz writes, if you haven't changed any of your perspectives, then it means you probably haven't learned anything in any of that time. Some examples that come to me about my own life are related to race and gender and ability, and I have a very different understanding of those issues now than I did, say, 20 years ago. When I think back about my earlier self, I feel like a bit of fondness, like I want to say, oh, bless your heart, honey. You didn't know all there was to know, and you were doing your best, right? And sometimes I also feel a little frustration, like, how could you not have seen the truth? It was right there. So to complete our thought experiment, I invite you now to consider how your answers to the big questions of life might be different 10 years in the future. This one's harder, right? It's hard to imagine that our hard-won and well-reasoned conclusions of today might turn out to be worthy of tossing in the trash in the future. It's an interesting feature of human self-regard that we tend to think that whatever conclusions we've come to in this very moment are the pinnacle of our development. Phew, thank goodness we got that figured out, right? And so this project of learning and self-assessment, it requires a huge dose of humility, an understanding that you don't know everything that you may know in the future. If you've been to our recent worship services, you know that we're making our way through the values that are highlighted here on the chancel table: love, justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity. And these values come from the version of our Unitarian Universalist Association's bylaws that we approved at General Assembly in Pittsburgh last month. If you've been hearing about these and have trouble remembering them, I just have a funny mnemonic device for you that a colleague shared with me. It is love, jet, pig. It's memorable. Their congregation even made t-shirts. It's silly. So love, justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity. So back to the sermon. So in the proposed bylaws, each of these values is briefly described, and then the text articulates how we will covenant to live this value in the world. We're talking about transformation today, right? So the section related to transformation reads this way. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. Now, this valuing of transformation, like it says in the new bylaws, it goes way back in both our Unitarian and our Universalist heritages. One of the touchstones of the liberal theological tradition from which we come is the idea that revelation is not sealed. For theists, this means that theists believe that God continuously reveals God's truth in the world, that very little is set in stone. And if you're not a theist, it means that non-theists are open to truth's revelation in the world from wherever it comes. For both, this again requires humility and open-heartedness, and remembering that just because you feel like you figured things out at this moment, it doesn't mean you might not change your mind later. Our understandings change as we learn and grow, and as the world around us changes. The storybook people that were a good example of this humility and this flexibility. When their house burned, and then the water rose and made a flood, they did not stay stubbornly attached to the structure of their house. They took what they had, they adapted it to the new circumstances. Again, when they reached the shore, they did not stay on the boat and wait for the water to move. They reconfigured what they had into a truck and continued on their journey. Our human journeys here together are also affected by things like fires, floods, literal and metaphorical. They push us to examine our perspectives, to reconsider what it is we want to hold on to. And we know that we can return to our faith community when we're seeking support for that examination and healing. But our faith is not just a place to hide out and think and get settled and get complacent. It's also a catalyst or a prod for more transformation. There's an old saw that says that the minister's job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And there's also the joke about UUs that our congregations are places where your answers will be questioned. These come from the truth that our faith pushes us to embrace transformation, and our faith offers that solid ground to keep us stable while we do it. Transformation for each of us is going to look different, and what moves us to change, whether it's art or a great nonfiction book or a conversation with someone new, that will be different for each of us too. But our eventual goal in this faith is to bring more love into this world that is both so broken and so worthy of our attention. In our faith, we'll keep learning more and more about how to bring more love into the world, this love that undergirds all these 6 other values. This learning isn't always easy. It's possible for us to assume that we've arrived at the pinnacle of our development. But last time I looked, the world did not reflect the beloved community that we yearn to bring into being. Where is your growing edge in this, as Howard Thurman describes it? That place that is on the border of death and life, where something old can give way to something new. Our work then is to do, as Chinese-American activist Grace Lee Boggs said, nurture that growing edge to transform ourselves in order to transform the world. Are you with me? Keep your heart open, 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 you gotta keep your heart wide open, though the waves try to push you around. You gotta keep your heart wide open till your faith brings you back to solid ground. Amen.